because apparently we came to find there were actually a lot of College of Charleston students, like active students who did not have housing. They were just bumming on couches, in some of the most extreme cases, park benches a lot of the time. So just really inconsistent, unreliable housing, which, as you can imagine, negatively impacts almost every facet of an individual's life. And without that sort of, you think of Maslow's hierarchy, without like at the very base level being supported with things like shelter and food, how can you ever begin to even think about, forget self-actualization? How can you even just begin to think about being a contributing member of society?
Welcome to episode 52 of People Are the Answer. I truly believe that people are the only answer to the world's many problems. I'm Jeffrey M. Zucker, a serial entrepreneur, here to learn how innovators are creating outsized, transformational social impact. Today's episode features Steve Fletcher, Director of Economic Development at Lowcountry Local First, an advocacy and support organization for local independent businesses in the Charleston, South Carolina area. Steve started his career in PR, has spent time in hospitality and music, and after earning a master's in public administration, became focused on local economic development. Steve and I discuss his career journey to ultimately finding his calling, supporting local businesses, and improving their chances at success. Here is Steve Fletcher on People Are the Answer. Steve, thanks so much for joining me on People Are the Answer.
Yeah, great to be here, Jeffrey. Thank you.
Happy to have you, and I would love if you could start off by just telling us who you are, where you're based, and your current role.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, my name is Steve Fletcher. I work with Lowcountry Local First, which is a local economic development nonprofit headquartered right here in sunny, well, not so sunny today, but typically sunny South Carolina, right in the Lowcountry, which is sort of the greater Charleston area. And my role at Lowcountry Local First is Director of Economic Development.
And what would you say in life in general motivates you?
Wow, I mean, a lot to unpack there. I think there are various things that motivate me, and it's also dependent upon, as you can imagine, whether we're talking about work or life or the intersection thereof. I think generally speaking, lately, and by lately I mean maybe the last 5 to 10 years of my life, the primary motivating factors are in some way, shape, or form related to trying to do good. I know that's super nebulous, but trying to think about ways to positively impact the environment that I'm living in and the people who live there.
Yeah, no, that's great. And while it might sound vague, doing good, it's important, and everybody thinking about that will go a really long way.
Yeah, I like to think so.
So you mentioned you're in Charleston now. Where did you grow up, and what was it like there?
Yeah, good question. I grew up in New Jersey. I was there from about the age of, well, not about, I was there from the exact age of 0 to up to, well, I moved away when I went to college. So I was there for about the first 18 or 17 years of my life. Come from northern New Jersey, Morris County. It's sort of a north central county in New Jersey. And it was great growing up there. I mean, the seasons were more identifiable. The change between the seasons was a lot more dramatic than here in the South. Culturally, very, very different in a lot of ways, and in some ways not so different. I've also lived in other places like San Diego and other spots over the years. And I will say that there's actually a lot that connects the Northeast and the Southeast socioculturally, and maybe some of that is in some way, shape, or form tied to weather, but also to history and to politics to a degree. But in any case, loved growing up there. Big Bruce Springsteen fan. I don't know if that's what you expected when you asked the question, but I'm taking it and running with it. There's a lot about New Jersey I liked, but like Bruce Springsteen, there was always this desire to get out and see the rest of the world. A lot of his music has wanderlust sort of woven into it, and so lo and behold, after a stint at a college kind of in the mid-Atlantic region, I decided I'd go farther south and wound up in Charleston.
Nice. Yeah. And I, having gone to school in Boston, I agree, that relation between cities in the South and cities in the Northeast. And a lot of that, like you said, is really tied to history. I felt like Boston had a lot of similar amounts of historical culture around it that Charleston had, and early settlers and things like that. So it's cool to see that.
For sure. And we talked before. My brother went to BU and had a really good time up there. And my mom's family is kind of from Massachusetts in New England, and so yeah, I've got fond memories of growing up in the cold winters with 2-3 feet of snow and snow days. I mean, you get a sprinkling of snow here in Charleston, and people's eyes bulge out of their heads. Rightfully so. They're not used to it.
Yep, the city shuts down for a while. I've remember that from as a kid when it snowed like once every 10 years. Um, but all right, you mentioned going to college a little bit further south in Williamsburg, Virginia. William and Mary, how was that experience for you?
It was great. I'd say it was, not unlike other kids who are going off to college in a state different from their home state. It was my first real experience living somewhere other than the place I grew up for an extended period of time. And I found it really, fun and scary and exciting and liberating. It was a great environment at William and Mary, very conducive to and supportive of learning new things and having sort of a broad view of the world as it is and as it could be and as it was. So great liberal arts education there, and a really good, opportunity to meet folks from all across the country and across the world. So Williamsburg, Virginia is by no means Paris, but it is an international destination for people looking to dig into a unique historical landscape. You've got, yes, the sort of the butter churners and the steel workers reenacting things in colonial Williamsburg, which is right down the street from the college. But you've also got sort of this again international academic institution, and you've got people coming to learn about the founding of the nation, and so there's just a lot going on there. There's a lot of cool energy there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the trip that I personally remember to Williamsburg was our seventh grade trip. We got on a bus and went to Williamsburg, Virginia, and that's probably the most that I've interacted with it. But it definitely has a lot of history and sounds like a cool place to go to school.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, I enjoyed it weather-wise. I keep talking about the weather, but yeah, weather-wise, it was great. Educationally, socially, it was a really good experience. They had actually a fun fact about Williamsburg, Virginia, pretty bizarre. But there's a Wawa. And are you familiar with Wawas, like a food, grocery, gas
I
station?
am, yeah, like mythical convenience store
Yeah,
that people love to gush about.
did not
mythical to
realize
me
it.
as
Yeah, I didn't understand that it was mythical until I was there. But yes, it's like this. It's held on this pedestal as being like this, uniquely amazing proprietor of cold sandwiches and lottery tickets and natural light beer. Um, there's one near campus there that apparently has the highest net revenue of any non-gas station Wawa in the country, which I thought was like a bizarre piece of trivia there, and something that occasionally students from William and Mary will hang their hats on.
I like it. I like it. No, that's definitely something to be proud of. And from there, you got into your career. It looks like you started off doing content creation and more traditional PR. Like, tell me how you got interested in that, and how.
Yeah, I sort of fell into that. I moved back to New Jersey after William and Mary. Didn't know, where I belonged or what I should be working on, or what sorts of jobs I should be applying to. Was fortunate enough to have a family connection. So was privileged to be able to take advantage of a relationship between my parents and an individual who owned a boutique PR firm in Midtown Manhattan. Sort of interned there. The internship turned into a junior account executive role, and I sort of just dove into the world headlong of public relations and learned a lot over the course of, I don't know how long I was there, maybe a year. I'd take the train in from Dover, New Jersey every morning and take it back to Dover, New Jersey from Penn Station every night. And I would commute in, learn a lot over the course of the day. I had some friends who took jobs in New York City after graduating William and Mary. I also had friends from high school who had found their way to New York City, Manhattan, or one of the boroughs. And I'd sync up with them after work, and we'd talk and we'd exchange ideas. And, I've always had sort of an artistic vein as well that I like to tap into. And many of the people I associate with are artistic in some way, shape, or form. My wife's a poet, my friends have been musicians, etc. So New York was just like this perfect petri dish to be exploring and to be using to feed and fuel my sort of youthful, desires to experience it all, whether it was art or business or science, or philosophy, or drinking cheap beer or expensive beer. I mean, like you could experience the whole gamut of what much of the spectrum of what life has to offer in a large metropolitan area like New York City. And so working at Source Communications, which was the name of the PR firm there for a while, it taught me a lot about PR and reaching out to organizations and initiatives and businesses in a strategic way, and learned a lot about earned media and the importance of it, and branding and messaging and storytelling and copywriting, but also just learned a lot about what it means to like live in a city and to be an active member of it. And I there were certainly elements of it that I despised, from the lifestyle to the work. And eventually those were such that I reached sort of a Gladwellian tipping point, needed to move out of the city. But I do look back fondly on the things that I was able to extract, the positive experiences and skill sets that I was able to take away from my experience at Source Communications in New York.
I mean, I can only imagine what you can learn there. And even learning the PR space, I feel like teaches you about a lot of other spaces as well, whether it's, PR, or whether it's politics, journalism, marketing even. So
yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
It sounds like some great experience. And, where did you go from there? And I know you said you spent some time in San Diego and Charleston. So where was next?
Charleston was next, but I knew I needed to save up some real money. I was pouring all of my Source Communications money as a junior account executive, which was like a glorified intern, directly into the NJ Transit system, which I have nothing but love and respect for, but it is extremely expensive. And so I didn't have much disposable income to be able to make a big change and a big move, but knew I wanted to move somewhere. Ended up syncing up with a buddy of mine who was working in Boston, Massachusetts at the time. I knew him from college. He and I both decided we wanted to move somewhere south. Long story short, many Google image searches later, we narrowed down our journey, our quest for the perfect city to Charleston, South Carolina. I had never been to Charleston, had never been to the Lowcountry. I think I drove through maybe South Carolina on my way to Panama City Beach for a spring break. So was not super familiar with this mystical, magical destination, but sort of knew I wanted to give it a shot. And ended up making a number of decisions, one of which was to save up a bunch of money, working at some restaurants in New Jersey, move back in with the folks, was able to accrue the necessary fundage to be able to head down south. So did that for 6 or 8 months. This white tablecloth Italian place in northern New Jersey. Shout out to Cafe Navona. Go check it out. Delicious penne dishes. And Marco Di Filippis, the whole family, they know what they're doing. And it brings me back to another point. I've worked at maybe 8 or 9 restaurants over the years, and I know we'll fast forward eventually to some of my work in economic development, but there are many things in the moment I think to myself, I will never use this again. This is like a pause. This is sort of the thing that happens in between the two important things. This feels like I'm stalling. But looking back, and maybe this is just the brain's way of like making yourself feel better about your life, or how you cope emotionally with experiences that don't seem immediately beneficial or valuable or satisfying. But as I look back on, working at restaurants and getting cuts and scrapes in the dish pit, I think to myself, or I look back in New York City and the hustle and the bustle and the uncertainty, getting paid, low wages. Certainly I am more privileged than most, and that I always had some semblance of a familial network and support system and safety net to fall back on if, God forbid, anything went south. But I also just really, really, looking back, appreciate the positives that I took away from those experiences, like for example, have a real affinity, and I wouldn't have known this had I not worked as servers and bartenders. I have a real affinity for restaurants and hospitality and food and bev, and I have a respect for folks who work there, and I have almost like a poetic appreciation for the theater and the ebb and the flow and the dance of those experiences in those places. These coffee shops, restaurants, cafes, they're community hubs, they're intersections where people and place and conversation merge, and beautiful things can come out of those and beautiful things can go into those. They're just these like cool connective nodes. And there's nothing quite like an amazing cafe where you sit down al fresco outside. It's 75 degrees. There's a light breeze. There's a beautiful, like maybe lavender arrangement, and you're smelling that, and you're drinking a cappuccino, and you've met with an old friend that you haven't seen in 8 years. And there's sort of the din of the clatter and clanking of the plates and the dishes in the background, and there's just this energy there that is unmistakable and super unique. So I'm sorry, I'm totally going off on a digression.
No, you're good.
But yeah, all that's to say, like that's sort of important to me, right? Those like real time, in-person, physical experiences where there's a commission of ideas and community and people. I want to bring that, and I strive to establish spaces like that, digital and physical, wherever I go with whatever I'm doing. So I've taken a lot with me from those restaurant, food and bev, hospitality experiences.
Yeah, I can relate for sure. I spent quite a bit of time in the hospitality space, and you learn a tremendous amount on so many levels and don't realize at the time how much it's going to impact not only your life, but your compassion in those types of situations and just your respect, like you're saying. And I think anybody that's physically able should do what they can to work in the service industry at some point in their lives.
Yeah. Yeah, completely agree.
So you saved up money. Charleston was on the list of a couple cities that you thought would be the best place to move. And it looks like based on your LinkedIn that you stopped in Charleston and then went to San Diego?
Yeah, exactly. I was in Charleston for a little bit. I grafted on to a very small startup called Matchstick Social as a content creator there. Basically was just like helping businesses in town, like Gerald's tire
Yeah.
shop.
Yep.
You're probably familiar with them, having lived in Charleston, right? I mean, they're like an
Absolutely. Everybody knows
institution.
yeah, everybody knows their famous ad in Charleston.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And so we were a part of some of their creative visioning and branding and copywriting. Primarily, we were focused on businesses' social media ads. So we were creating ads and doing A/B testing, figuring out what works, what doesn't work, coming up with ideas around why certain combinations of words and pictures and videos did or didn't work. And by work, I mean we're proactively engaged with by a higher than average number of prospective customers, and then were conversions happening after those customer interactions, that sort of thing. After that, moved out to San Diego with my then girlfriend, now wife, who I met here in Charleston. She was pursuing her MFA in poetry at SDSU. So we went out there for like 9 or 10 months and had a number of jobs out there. That was a completely new experience to me. Had never lived in California, had only ever been to California briefly as part of a cross-country trip with a buddy of mine right after college. So that was an interesting experience, and we only stayed out there for about a year, and then she actually transferred credits over to the College of Charleston's MFA program. They had a poetry concentration and an MFA program in general that was brand new, and so she moved back here to be closer to her family. We both liked the idea of kind of moving back to the East Coast, and so other than a brief respite out in San Diego, I've pretty much, remained on the East Coast.
And when you got back, you said that you'd had a few jobs in San Diego. Where were you career-wise? How were you feeling about the PR space? Is that when you started to look at other areas?
Yeah, great question. I was lucky enough to be able to form some relationships in the preceding years, both at Source and at Matchstick, and develop the skills necessary to further business relationships with certain accounts. So there were individuals who I had met in the preceding 3 or 4 years who needed work done on their social media accounts or wanted blog posts written or guest posts, submitted to various digital outlets. And, I enjoyed writing. I've always enjoyed writing and storytelling and kind of putting pen to paper and coming up with an idea in a unique way. And so I was able to sort of do some of that out in California digitally, remotely. This is like way before we've now become an environment business wise that is very conducive to and accommodating of remote work. But I was able to luckily, do a lot of that completely out of state, out of time zone. And that worked out. That helped kind of supplement my income. But I was also, doing a number of other sort of unique, creative, one-off things out there. And by creative, I don't mean, artistically creative. I mean like, oh shoot, how am I going to figure out how to like pay rent next month, or, how are we going to figure out how to pay these bills? And so I worked at DoorDash. I went door to door selling KPBS donations. I was soliciting donations for the San Diego PBS affiliate, getting dogs sicked on me, and people were yelling at me to get off their lawns. But that, again, though it was kind of an unsavory experience in the moment, I can look back with the benefit of 2020 hindsight and realize that there was fortunately some positive that came out of that door-to-door experience. I learned how to interact with people, how to have sort of cold interactions, that is communications and conversations with people who were maybe not even expecting to ever meet me, and suddenly I'm at their doorstep talking to them, sort of ingratiating myself to them, hopefully, if I'm doing it right, and telling them a little bit about the sort of thing I'm selling and maybe how it could connect to their life or enhance their life based on information that I'm gathering in real time. So that was helpful as well. I think I carried a lot of that along with me.
Yeah, no, that sounds like another really interesting experience that, like you said, maybe you didn't appreciate as much at the time, but you learned a lot, built character, and then, you're back in Charleston, and you went to get a master's in public administration at College of Charleston. And what led you to that? What made you want that degree?
Yeah, great question. So came back to Charleston, and I'd always played music here and there. I'd been in bands in high school. I had been in bands in college, post-college. I had a lot of sort of solo tours and different musical adventures. And I knew I wanted music to be some part of my life. So right when we moved back from San Diego, I actually pursued music in probably the most serious and intentional way I had ever pursued music. It was like truly a professional attempt to make music a sustainable central feature of my life. So moved into, my parents own a shore house, the Jersey Shore. My wife and I, or my, at the time, girlfriend and I, moved into said house, which had no heat, no central air. It was like winter. We had space heaters plugged in. This is like a 100-year-old home that they actually ended up recently knocking down. This was, almost a decade ago, or about 7 years ago, 6 years ago. Just recorded an album, basically. Wrote some songs, played some live shows, recorded a record called Songs from Island Avenue being the name of the street where I kind of grew up over the summers in New Jersey.
Is there a genre that you'd say your music fits into?
It's sort of like, if I had to give it a genre, I would call it probably like, I'm drawn to heartland rock and Americana and indie folk and sort of the intersection there. So it's probably like a pared back acoustic version of that. It's sort of like if someone's familiar with sort of Brian Fallon or Bruce Springsteen's early stuff, where he's experimenting more with sort of acoustic, upbeat, lyric central stuff. I would probably call it that. It's sort of, indie folk or singer-songwriter or Americana, I suppose.
I mean, it's really cool that you took that opportunity to do that and focus on something like music that you're passionate about. And, where did that lead on the music side? And I'm also curious, do you still play music, and, what instruments you play?
Yeah. Unfortunately it didn't pan out the way I wanted it to, right? On some level, you've always got, when you're pursuing the arts, it's so uncertain. Um, it is it is largely based on the imperfect economic model that we've set up for ourselves as Americans. I think it works in a lot of ways, and it doesn't work in a lot of ways, and for a lot of people, and for a lot of pursuits. And one of those pursuits is art. Unfortunately, there's sort of a market failure that is art. I mean, no matter, it's not a meritocratic system. So what I mean by that is, you could be an amazing sculptor, and just because you're an amazing sculptor objectively, right, you create sculptures that are smooth, or I don't know anything about sculpture, so I should probably stop right here. But point is, sculptors who know a thing or two about sculpting might identify a sculpture and the accompanying sculptor of said sculpture as being like phenomenal, right? Top of the crop. This is an example of beautiful artwork that takes a lot of skill and time, and years have gone into learning how to do this sort of thing. Just because it's amazing art, or he or she is an amazing, or they are an amazing artist, that does not unfortunately translate into um, a life that can be sustained by said art and said wares the way that, and it doesn't always work this way, but in the entrepreneurial space or the business world or the more traditional uh, realm of free market capitalism and the sort of economy that we have, if again, it doesn't always work, but generally speaking, if you do all the right things and you have the right support structures and you understand how to identify and secure capital, whether it's funding or grants or loans, and you sort of understand how the game works, you can put all of the factors into place accordingly and create a life for yourself that is largely built around that enterprise. Unfortunately, art is just not really that enterprise. You've got a top 0.0001% of artists who maybe have the most downloads or the most streams or have sold the most, vinyl, and they are able to sustain a lifestyle for themselves. But then you've got everyone else who's just barely making it. So I was sort of the everyone else category when I was trying to pursue music as a career. I played some shows at some venues that are known or are reputable in certain circles. I've played at like Radio Bean in Burlington, and I've played at Rockwood Music Hall in New York City. And, I've set up tours with my brother and I. We were in a band called Another Brother Band that was another sort of almost like modern Simon and Garfunkel type band. We played all originals. It just never really panned out, and it wasn't for lack of trying. Although I will say, though I did a lot of marketing and branding and tried to employ those things that I had learned over the years at Matchstick Social and Source Communications, part of me just realized my heart was not in the marketing and PR and branding side of it. It felt to me almost conflictive with the artistic and creative side of it. I think that's another really big issue for musicians and artists and sculptors and poets, of which my wife is one. It just becomes really tough to be able to like figure out how you're going to at once be someone who is a creative artistic storyteller and also someone who's going to be able to like commoditize and monetize that. And I don't think those are bad words. I think you need to, if you're going to work within this imperfect system, as I mentioned, you're going to have to learn how to, unfortunately, I know it sounds icky and sticky, it doesn't have to, but you're going to have to find ways to sell yourself as an artist in order to reap the rewards of that and find some sort of sustainable model for yourself.
Yeah, it sounds like you and I have similar tastes in music in a lot of ways, and I've certainly loved some smaller musicians and bands that, yeah, I mean, they're artists, they're not business people, they don't want to be, and unfortunately, for this business to sustain you these days, you kind of have to be to some extent, or someone has to be on your behalf. And it can be a difficult thing to find. And yeah, occasionally those perfect storms where someone that's all artist gets noticed by the right person that then, helps do all that. And but
Yeah,
it's few
completely.
and
I
far
mean, you're right.
between.
You're right. Like there can be a lightning in the bottle situation where, it's just serendipitously the right person is in the crowd at the right time. And that individual ends up being, your agent, who knows all these other people who can give you great opportunities. I mean, everyone's kind of looking for their break because so much of making it, and I'm doing air quotes for the listening audience, is contingent on luck, unfortunately.
Yeah, it really is. I forget who I was talking to the other day that was just, maybe I was even reading something where Bryan Cranston was talking about the luck that he's had over the years, and how, he got his big breaks in like his 40s and 50s, and not everybody gets big breaks. A lot of it's luck. So I can only imagine, to some extent, on the music side. I work in the film space, and I'm trying to get a little bit of luck for some of my projects.
Oh,
And
that's cool. What sorts of
yeah, hopefully
films?
I work on all sorts. Mostly focused on comedy feature films at the moment, but we've worked on TV series, as well as a variety of unscripted things, like a documentary about Israeli and Palestinian musicians,
Oh,
a
wow,
project on
that's awesome.
counterterrorism. Yeah, a lot
Oh,
of
that's really cool.
interesting irons in the fire in that space.
Yeah,
We'll
very
see where they
cool.
go.
Very cool. Well, good luck with that. Yeah, I'm a big documentary fan as well. So yeah, good luck with that. That the Palestinian and Israeli musician documentary sounds particularly interesting. Would be curious to learn more about that at some point.
Yeah, it's called Prophets of Change, and hopefully coming to a platform of some sort near you in the near future.
Nice.
Always happy to dig further into this with you, but in the meantime, let's get back to you a little bit. So you embarked on this musical endeavor, decided that you weren't into the business side enough to make it sustainable. What was your next move from there?
Next move from there was moving out, and my wife, at the time, by the way, was also self-publishing a book of poetry. So we were both kind of cloistered in this house, three houses off the ocean, and kind of like engaged in our creative pursuits, which was cool. But yeah, we both figured, okay, now it's time maybe to pivot back into society, and we came out of our reclusive artistic den, and we ended up actually moving back to Charleston. We didn't know what we wanted to do for a while. I still played a couple gigs in Charleston. I worked at Ellis Creek Fish Camp, which is this spot on James Island. I was bartending and serving there. Um, and my wife was finishing her MFA at College of Charleston. And then eventually I decided, well, I don't know that I want to be doing this forever. So I'm going to go back and get my degree in public administration, which, for your listeners who don't know, is sort of like the public sector's answer to a degree in business administration. So rather than an MBA, an MPA is focused not on business operations, but rather sort of the operations and inner workings of government and nonprofits. So I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, but I thought to myself, you know what? I've done a number of things in the private sector, but for me to continue on and be happy in the private sector, I'd have to find such a specific niche, sort of social entrepreneurial endeavor. And I just don't know that that exists in Charleston. And I really like Charleston. So I physically want to stay here, but maybe I don't want to work in the private sector. So I decided, okay, how do I make this really big pivot? Not late in life, but like, not immediately after graduating undergrad either, right? So how do I kind of intentionally move from one world to another world, and not get stuck in that sort of middle nether space where you're, playing guitar after having worked a lunch shift at a oyster roast. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but unfortunately, it just was not conducive to the sort of life I wanted to live at the time. So anyway, got my MPA, loved the program. I highly recommend College of Charleston's Master of Public Administration program. Learned a lot, met a lot of phenomenal people, really scratched that itch that I was realizing I had had for a long time, around how can I make a more meaningful, positive impact on the society at large and my little corner of it. And that meant a lot of things. And there was a lot to unpack there. And I learned about, nonprofit management and sort of how to make sure a nonprofit or a government entity is financially solvent. I mean, a lot of these skills are business skills as well, but everything is informed by this undergirding of empathy, honestly. And I liked that. It wasn't strictly money driven, it was also mission driven work. How can we make society a little bit better? How can we make our town a little bit more inclusive, a little bit more empathetic? how can we make people a little bit healthier or a little bit more willing to communicate between siloed groups, and those can be siloed on many different demographic lines. So I really loved the MPA program, came out of that program, and then, sort of just hit the ground running, eventually ended up working at Lowcountry Local First.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And I like how you said, like, a little bit better in this, a little bit better in that, because that shows the willingness to have incremental change. I've found that in kind of this divisive society that we live in, regardless of what side of the aisle someone is on, the loudest voices tend to be all or nothing, and real change and impact happens incrementally. And so it's important to just be comfortable moving things in the right direction. And, I work a lot in drug policy reform, and I'm on the board of the Marijuana Policy Project, and we are very open to incremental state-by-state change within the cannabis space, with the ultimate goal of ending the drug war and, getting people treated equally in these situations. But, one small step in each individual market is, could be access for another patient or one less person that's going to prison for this plant. So it's a big proponent of incremental change.
Yeah, that's super. I totally agree. And also just, I'll say I'll extend what I said to include, I have always appreciated the importance of finding solutions that transcend, socio-political inclinations or predispositions, particularly working here in Charleston, South Carolina. Again, I'm from the Northeast. I'm from a different socio-cultural environment. So in order to get things done wherever you are, it doesn't always, the loudest voice is not necessarily the voice most likely to get things done. It's going to be a combination of, yes, forcefulness and conviction, but also of understanding and empathy and willingness to hear others out. I mean, it's so crucial to be listening to what other people are saying. I think the best conversationalists are the best listeners, right? I mean, that's no coincidence. I think I do a lot of talking. I talk here on things like, and when I'm lucky enough, fortunate enough to be able to be an interviewee on a great program like this. I also have my own podcast, 2 podcasts. One's a music podcast. One is for Lowcountry Local First. I'm a musician. I live with a poet. I do copyright every day. I communicate with a lot of people. I'm shaking hands and networking. There's a lot of output in my life. I'm keenly aware of that, probably sometimes way too much. My wife would definitely agree with that statement, I think. But I'd like to think I'm also a relatively good listener. I like to be an active one, and I like to know my audience. I think, you could talk all day long until you're blue in the face, but really it's not landing anywhere if you don't understand the layout and makeup of the landing strip, right? You could have like the best jet in the world, but if you don't know where you're coming down, you're going to run out of fuel and crash. So you've got to understand your environment before all else when you're trying to make real change. And I agree with you, particularly incremental change.
Yeah, no, that's a great thing to have learned, and so true. And so you're, very much, it's very clear how much this MPA, affected you and your mindset around things. It's really cool to see. And I know while you were a graduate student, you spent time as the director of training at Youth Count. Could you tell us some more about that?
Yeah, Youth Count was a program. I don't know that they're doing it anymore. It was maybe just for 1 or 2 years. This was the inaugural year that we were synced up with this particular initiative. It was a program to get a better understanding. This was sort of an unprecedented data capture, better understanding of the housing insecurity problem amongst the youth in Greater Charleston, South Carolina. Housing insecurity and food insecurity. So we were trying to get an understanding of, who are the housing insecure young people in Charleston and beyond? Where are they? And once we find them, how do we, in an emotionally, educated way, interact with them such that we can gather super robust data, which will then ideally down the line be actionable so that we can actually connect these folks. We would sort of in the field when we, got a tip that there was maybe some folks here or there, or we would slowly cultivate relationships, trust-based relationships with groups who would be able to connect us with at-risk youths. And once we made those connections, we would, if as they were willing, have a, again, emotionally empathetic conversation with them. And there was a lot of training that went into making those emotionally empathetic. And we would try to capture data around their living circumstances. And all of this would be captured in a way that then we could, in aggregate, get a slightly, this was the idea, this was the aspiration, a slightly better understanding of how this problem has come to be, the youth housing insecurity and food insecurity problem, that is, and also how it may be fixed through a combination of policy proposals and organic, just human outreach and the creation of nonprofits and how these things can work together. So what I did during Youth Count, and this was through the Community Assistance Program at the Master of Public Administration program at CFC, was I was the recruitment head or director of recruitment and training. So we would find basically the survey administrators, so people who out in the field would have these physical surveys that were really long. I helped create the survey, but my singular designation was the training director. So once people had these surveys, or once we had identified these people who would be administrating these surveys, it was up to me to basically train them in the skill sets needed to capture both emotionally enlightened, meaning like kind of empathetically administered questioning, but also capture data that was scientifically sound. So I did that through inviting people from the community, from MUSC, and from like suicide prevention organizations, because these were youths who were really, really, in many cases, because of circumstances they had been living in for a long time, these were youths who had been failed by the system, were extremely traumatized in one way or another. So we didn't want to just like disturb the kind of underlying directive was do no harm. So we wanted to make sure this was at the very least kind of a net neutral in terms of the good produced, but at very most was going to make monumental change and going to decrease housing insecurity amongst youth in Charleston, and some real actionable stuff, some real some solid outcomes did arise after that program. College of Charleston instituted a program by which students could come in, no questions asked. They'd get pinged on their phone that there were going to be this amount of food, this type of food at this place at this time. And they could sort of come in and make use of that pantry. Because apparently we came to find there were actually a lot of College of Charleston students, like active students who did not have housing. They were just bumming on couches, in some of the most extreme cases, park benches a lot of the time. So just really inconsistent, unreliable housing, which, as you can imagine, negatively impacts almost every facet of an individual's life. And without that sort of, you think of Maslow's hierarchy, without like at the very base level being supported with things like shelter and food, how can you ever begin to even think about, forget self-actualization? How can you even just begin to think about being a contributing member of society? So it was really important work, and I enjoyed it, but it was only about a semester that we worked with them. So I didn't really know the very infant stage of the program or a lot of what came out of the program in terms of deliverables or outcomes, but I did really learn a lot from being integral to the training of those survey administrators.
Yeah, it sounds like a great experience, and you got to work with Charleston's youth and learn even more about the city and about this causes you were working on. And I want to dig into Lowcountry Local First. That's definitely the highlight of what we're here to discuss. And so you got your MPA. Where was your mind after that? And, at what point did you start working with Lowcountry Local First?
So I started about 4 years ago working with Lowcountry Local First. It's 2023 now. So right out of graduation, right out of the MPA program, I was looking for a job, as you can imagine. And a colleague of mine sent over this position for Lowcountry Local First. It was actually the community manager job. So at the time, the job description that I applied for was just basically running the co-working space that Lowcountry Local First runs. And for those unfamiliar, I know at the top I mentioned briefly what LLF is, but I was super interested in the organization when I saw this job description, because it was like a lot of what I had been looking for. So it's a local economic development nonprofit, and that essentially means it is a nonprofit that's been here in Charleston for 15 years that focuses on supporting local independent businesses. In addition to that, we run a number of campaigns over the course of the year that educate the greater citizenry of Charleston as to why it's so important to support these businesses, and then also how they can very easily shift a lot of their spending to these local independent businesses. And so I love that idea. I love the mission component of the work. But what I really loved at the time, frankly, was that this was a sort of it was reminiscent in many ways of my work in the hospitality sector, because I would be running a physical space, which was this co-working space, but it was also, as it was described in the description, and this ended up being the case, it was also this really inspired sort of community hub where you would hang local artists' artwork on the walls and allow them to have a no-cost exhibition one night during their multiple month sort of takeover of the space. You'd also be able to set up as community manager your own workshops and webinars and opportunities for folks to come together and network. I mean, you could just do little things like a potluck, or you could have bigger partnerships like we did with an organization called INAP LLC, run by an individual who has found like the importance in relaxing your psoas muscle, which is PSOAS, in the middle of the workday for 15 minutes, and all of the incredible benefits it can have. So I reached out to her. She became a member of the wider organization. Then we had her in. We pushed all of the tables and chairs out of the way in a conference room. We were able to invite all of the coworkers who were working in the space at the time into that room to partake in their very own little 15-minute INAP, right? And we try to sort of capture data informally about whether or not that helped them. But we were just looking for ways to highlight different local independent businesses and make the space really creative, really accessible, really contract free. Ended up taking that job and was in the community manager position for a while, for about a year, until it ended up kind of morphing into other roles.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, I love the work that you guys are doing. And, in a place like Charleston that is just blowing up, I left for college in 2006, and it's just blown up unbelievably since then. And with that, for better or worse, it's been blowing up. But with that, you're starting to see some local businesses fall out, losing spaces to chains and things like that. And it starts to lose some of the character that brought people there initially, that made it such a tourist destination and a great place to live. So I like that you guys are protecting that in a sense. And I really like the language I saw on your website, lifting up traditionally overlooked entrepreneurs. So can you just talk about working with those entrepreneurs while also, dealing with all this growth in the community?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do a lot of things at LLF. We have a lot of different programs. What you're referring to, I believe, is certainly woven into everything we do in some way, shape, or form. But we do have one program in particular which focuses on traditionally overlooked entrepreneurs and how we can support them in a number of ways. That would be our Good Enterprises program. It's been around for just about as long as I've been at the organization, because the director of that program, Raquel Paget, started the same day I did. We've graduated about 200 students through the Good Enterprises Community Business Academy so far. And the Community Business Academy is, in essence, a program modeled after a program out of Jersey City, New Jersey called Rising Tide Capital, where we essentially train and support nascent stage entrepreneurs who are disproportionately from really from throughout Charleston, but are largely people of color, largely people who have been in one way, shape, or form socioeconomically disadvantaged through usually systemic racism or bigotry, or other obstacles to entrepreneurial success, or just other obstacles to success in general. Perhaps they can't find a job for one reason or another. Maybe they've had difficulty. Particularly lately, we've started our La Academia program, which is the Spanish-speaking cohort. And so maybe they've had difficulty kind of integrating into an English-speaking system, right? Not being able to speak the predominant language in a given metro area throws up a bunch of walls and obstacles for you, not the least of which is, how do I even begin to think about creating a banking account for my business, right? A lot of these folks who we serve don't have some of the basic elemental components of a business. And so we'll get them connected with folks who speak Spanish, or we'll get them connected with banks who are willing to work with them and help them build up their personal credit. And so we'll, try to break down some of those walls that stand between potential business owners or existing business owners and the support structures and the networking and the resources that they need to be successful. So in essence, the Community Business Academy 12-week program, we train entrepreneurs, we equip them with the skills, the tools, the resources they need to succeed, to flourish. They're nightly classes. A lot of these students already run their businesses or maybe work full-time for someone else. And we're just helping them sort of be supported such that they can get their business off the ground. So there's executive summaries, there's, cash flow projections. We do demonstrations in class to get them really comfortable with the lexicon, their vernacular, the ebb and the flow of doing business with their neighbors and their families. And then once they graduate the program, they have a direct pipeline into the larger Lowcountry Local First membership, which has about 600 members in it right now. They're paying members, but those CBA, those Community Business Academy students actually get that first year of membership for free. So it's sort of a wraparound service. They then also go on to business acceleration services, which is all about connecting them with a mentor in their field. And then eventually they're connected to something called Credit to Capital, which gets them connected to longer term funding sources if we've all deemed that that's something that would be beneficial to them at the time. And the whole program, to go back to your initial question, is about focusing on the traditionally overlooked entrepreneurs, the folks who have had particular difficulty in paving a way for themselves entrepreneurially, or have been unable to break into the systems that would help them further legitimize or grow or develop their business. And through pitch competitions and through training and through resources, we're able to sort of get them synced up with the sorts of support that we think will help them. And it's all to basically find ways, ideally, to establish pathways towards reliable, sustainable, generational wealth building. So we want to make sure we're setting up dynasties and legacies that for these families will last, hundreds of years into the future. This isn't just about one individual. This is about, yes, an individual, but also their family, their street, their neighbors, and eventually, the Lowcountry as a whole. So we're starting small and trying to grow from there.
Yeah, I mean, it's really cool to hear what you guys are working on, how you're supporting the community, these tremendous resources that you're offering these entrepreneurs. And myself working with a lot of small businesses and startup ventures, I know how just interesting and exciting and just how much work there is at these early stages. So you must get to see a lot of really fascinating things going on. If you're enjoying this episode, I would greatly appreciate if you could review, like, comment, or subscribe on your favorite platforms. Your engaged support goes a long way in helping the show grow and getting our impactful guests heard. Now back to the show. You mentioned starting off as community and partnership manager, eventually becoming development manager, and now in the role of director of economic development. Can you talk about how your role at LLF has evolved as you've been there?
Yeah. So it started out, I was running the co-working space. Then it shifted more into a focus on the membership and the kind of cultivation or stewardship of our members. And those are the businesses that pay to get access to a number of benefits that we offer as an organization. Then my role started to morph into a lot of morphing, right? A lot of transformation with my role and responsibilities. It's largely because Lowcountry Local First, not unlike other nonprofits, is pulled in a lot of different directions at once. Sometimes there's turnover when the organization isn't expecting it, or sometimes we can't afford to hire all of the people we want to afford for all of the little disparate, discrete roles and responsibilities. So people end up wearing a lot of different hats, and my experience was no exception to that. So I ended up kind of looking at gathering up corporate sponsorships for events, and I would do a lot of the sponsor solicitation to make sure that all of our great programming and events over the course of the year, things like Eat Drink Local Month or Buy Local Month, or our Chef's Potluck, where we connect restaurateurs and farmers and everyday citizens, making sure those things could happen. And they were largely sponsorship backed. We'd also charge tickets, of course. And we get funding from a lot of different funders as a nonprofit, but sponsors were sort of key to the whole recipe. And then I kind of moved away. It's funny, I sort of keep pieces of all of this. Not too much is getting pushed off the plate. As sort of versions of it follow me along. So I'm picking things up and I'm moving along. I'm now moving more into the development space, where I was working more directly one-on-one with donors and funders and philanthropy, and thinking strategically about ways to balance our budget and bring in more money for particular programs to make sure they could be the best programs they could be. And then from development manager, I became, just in the last year, the director of economic development, when our previous operations director, who was doing a lot of this type of work, left to join the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, which is a great organization, national organization. I sort of took on a lot of her roles. And so since then, I have been working on thinking about all the different ways we can support our local independent businesses such that they are flourishing, and therefore the community is flourishing as well.
Well, really appreciate that work that you're doing for the community, and just to see how your role has evolved. It's been you clearly are just growing in your passion for both the work as well as for Charleston. And as a native Charlestonian, I certainly appreciate it having good stewards.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I like to count myself among the good stewards. I appreciate that. I'm not a native Charlestonian, and so you, as a native Charlestonian, will know that there really are there's no such thing as you can't become a native Charlestonian. Obviously, I moved here about 10 years ago. I will say though that I've grown to love so much about this place, and I call it home now, and I hope to call it home for a very long time because of so much of what I've fallen in love with when it comes to Charleston. And so, yes, there are issues and there are obstacles, but there are also opportunities, and there are chances to kind of lean into what makes Charleston such a unique, magical environment, socially and environmentally, and trying to continually find ways to, behind the scenes and out in front of the front lines, sort of modify and twist and transform and lift up and amplify different people and groups and organizations and initiatives such that we are more inclusive and we are more diverse, and we are at the leading edge of things technologically and socially, and we are culturally vibrant, and we have not forgotten our history, and we honor all the right things and right people and right places. That's really important to everything I do as well. So as an organization called Lowcountry Local First, there's a lot of responsibility baked into being a director. It's not just about making sure businesses are doing well. Yes, that is a core feature of who we are and why we exist, but it's also making sure that all of those other aforementioned forces and dynamics are working together.
And speaking of those forces and dynamics, I saw, doing my research on LLF, that you promote policies and movements that are, advantageous to local independent businesses. Can you talk about some of those policies and movements? I know you mentioned to me some of your work on Folly Beach, for instance.
Yeah, we do a bunch of stuff. So right now, the Folly Beach work is formula business prohibition work. It's sort of it's what we do in order to, so for folks who aren't familiar with formula business districts, they are districts that have sort of zoning laws and legislation and policies baked into them. They've had bills passed or they've had policies proposed and accepted that essentially change the zoning regulations such that only certain businesses that look and feel and seem a certain way can be there. And we're speaking generally aesthetically. And what it does ultimately is sort of a creative way to box out some of the big box stores or the corporate chains. Folly Beach, for example, can't have really a Starbucks on Folly Beach unless it looked entirely unlike a Starbucks as you know it. And so as a result, really, there hasn't been a Starbucks that's moved in. We do have the delicious and great Center Street coffee right on Center Street, the main thoroughfare there, but we don't have a Starbucks. And so it's similar to all of the industries on Folly Beach because of that legislation passing a number of years ago. This predates my time, 4 or 5 years ago or more. We won't see those sorts of big box stores or chains or franchises on Folly. Now, Folly is a small community. We'd love to pass things like that, in Charleston proper, on James Island, which is next to Folly, in Mount Pleasant, which is one of the fastest growing metro areas in the region. And that's something we're always working on. We've done sort of a pilot version of that in Avondale, which is this micro neighborhood, this micro business district in West Ashley. And so we're always looking at ways to sort of pull levers politically and policy-wise behind the scenes. And we do lobbying. But we're also looking at creative ways to work with municipalities directly to try to engage with their entrepreneurs and make their sort of economic and political landscape as hospitable and accommodating as possible to those entrepreneurs. So, for example, we have a contract with James Island and a contract with Goose Creek right now to provide our programming and our education and our training and our hiring, not hiring, but education and training to those municipalities. And so we provide our community business academy to those municipalities. We're launching something called the Commercial Storefront Challenge, which we actually did on Reynolds Ave a number of years ago in North Charleston. Which is all about sort of reinvigorating a thoroughfare or a corridor or a district and bringing in as many local independent businesses as possible, making sure they're successful, finding creative ways to get those local independent businesses into those storefronts. So a lot of places like Goose Creek do not need help filling storefronts, right? They've got abandoned storefronts for a hot minute before some national chain wants to move into it. What we want to do is make sure that we're giving local independent businesses and retailers and commercial services businesses as much an opportunity as possible to be the ones who get sort of first dibs on some of those key commercial locations. So what we do is sometimes they're not always ready. If it's their first location or even their second location, these businesses might not quite have what it takes, the chutzpah, right? Or they might not have their I's dotted or their T's crossed such that they're able to move directly into their first home, their first brick and mortar. So we've created arrangements with the city and with funders to be able to subsidize on sort of a stepped scale rent for these businesses. So we can make sure that their operating costs, at least as far as rent and utilities perhaps is concerned, are super accessible and affordable for the first few months. And then we slowly, incrementally, to go back to sort of the incrementalism that we talked about before, it's all about incrementalism. We slowly, incrementally move them up to a competitive market rate. And the idea is, and we saw this happen at Reynolds, the idea is eventually these businesses find themselves in a position where they've got enough cash flow, they've got enough funding, they've got enough support that they're able to be successful in that new storefront. So that's one thing we do. And there's a tons of other, those are contracts we have with those municipalities. Talked about the Formula Business District work. We're always looking at ways to find out from our members what they need. And maybe it's parking, or maybe it's their employees need X, Y, or Z. And then we sort of try to reach out to the state senator, or the individual on council who is most interested in that conversation. And we'll see what can be done there. Just the other day, Marlon Kimpson ended up, Representative Kimpson is part of this pint bill. I don't think it's called pint bill. That's what we've had in the past here in Charleston, but it's proposed legislation to essentially make the customer landscape a little bit easier to navigate for folks who want to come into a brewery and purchase beer at said brewery. I know a long time ago, you'll remember, Jeffrey, because you're from Charleston, but you could only basically purchase alcohol in bars in, little airplane bottles. And if you went to a brewery, of which there were only 3 or 4 about 10 years ago, God help you, because you had to basically, you were relegated to purchasing like 1 beer, 2 beers. And then there were all these off-site rules as well as to what you could purchase to bring home in a growler. A lot of that is loosened up. This recent piece of legislation wants to loosen that up a little bit more to make these micro breweries as competitive as possible. That'd be the sort of thing that we would reach out to some of our members, like Pierce over at Common House Ale Works, right down the street from me right now. I'm working from home. He's in Park Circle. Or Chris over at Holy City Brewing, one of the oldest breweries in the area. Reach out to them, figure out what they think about this bill, and then reach out to the powers that be to figure out what are some of the best ways that we can extend exposure to this bill to sort of get the public on board with it as well. We explain why it's so advantageous to our members and therefore to them as citizens of Charleston, and then we just kind of help them connect the dots and get them to call their representatives to sort of endorse this.
Yeah, it's really cool to see that you're using a lot of innovative methods to help these local businesses, helping them train and learn, and also helping them on the policy front. So I feel like these businesses are in great hands, and it's inspiring to see. And I know as part of your work at LLF, you also have a podcast, Small Talks, Big Ideas. I'm looking forward to joining you on there soon. And
yeah, can't wait to have you.
Yeah, I wanted to first congratulate you on being a finalist for the City Paper's Best Local Radio Show.
Appreciate
And yeah, we
that.
just
Thank
love
you
if you
very
could
much.
tell us about the show.
Yeah, we're super excited about that. The show's been going on for about 2 years. It's a pretty freewheeling, unstructured, interview-based program where I interview a mover and shaker from the local independent business ecosystem about once every couple of weeks. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more frequently. Most recently, we had Monique and Shavalo Wilson Debriano, the founders and CEOs of Charleston Gourmet Burger Company. They went from trying out on Marion Square to have a little vendor stand right on Marion Square at their farmers market. Ended up getting that. Long story short, many burger recipes and sauce attempts later, they found themselves on the shelves of Kroger and Costco, and they were on QVC. They had a Facebook Live with 20,000 or 30,000 people watching. So they were actually members of ours right when they started back in 2011, I want to say 2011, 2012. And so we like to think we had some piece of their story. We help support them to some degree. And they mentioned that on the show. So yeah, Small Talks, Big Ideas with Steve. It's pretty much every other Monday. It's also broadcast in addition to being available on various podcast streaming platforms, also available on Ohm 96.3 FM. That's OHM. You can live stream it every other Monday at 12:30 p.m. Or if you're in the greater Charleston area, you can just tune in to 96.3. It's a really cool thing we have here at Ohm. They're basically this commercial-free, community-supported radio station. And the cool thing about Small Talks as well is like it's taken on a life of its own. So like this year, through a partnership with Ohm and with College of Charleston Master of Business Administration program and the Queen Street Playhouse, we've actually started doing live events. We just had our first one like a month ago at this historic theater in downtown Charleston called the Queen Street Playhouse. I sat up on stage with three other sort of marketing geniuses who are homegrown from right here in Charleston, or their business at least is from right here in Charleston. We talked on stage. We took questions from the audience. It was a live audience event, basically. It took like an hour and a half. There were folks who came in, and you could engage with the Queen Street Playhouse bar beforehand. It was really like a proper event, and it was really fun. I know a lot of podcasts now are doing these live events, and it injected an extra piece of energy into the program. We're doing 2 more of those before the year is out. And it's been a lot of fun.
And sounds like a great show. And what message are you hoping that people walk away with after they listen to your show?
That business owners are just people. That business owners are their neighbors. That small business owners are their family, their friends. Maybe they just don't know it yet. That they too can not just be a business owner, but can find themselves with a little bit of initiative and a little bit of exploration and maybe a little bit of luck as well and serendipity in a position where they can make for themselves and their dear ones a life that makes sense and matters and feels meaningful. I think business is one avenue, but there are many avenues. And I think representation is so important, and contact exposure is so important, and hearing from other people who live near you or have a skill set or an interest that is parallel or adjacent to yours, and seeing how they found ways to be successful, and then sort of trying to model that in your own life is such a key way to, engage with community and educate oneself and slowly but surely lift everyone up. So I think you asked a simple question. I'm giving you like a complicated answer, so I apologize for that. But I think at the end of the day, it's an interview show. I like interviewing people. I like having conversations. I hope that I ask some of the right questions, and I hope that occasionally there's an individual on the other end listening in who hears something that they can relate to, that maybe improves their life in some small way, maybe not immediately, but maybe down the road after they've explored some avenue they would not have explored earlier. So it's about making connections, and it's about unveiling, what makes people tick and what makes people inspired, and seeing whether there's a way to relate to that.
Well, I can relate in terms of hoping to inspire some people, hoping to spur some movement and getting people to do good work. So I really appreciate that. I'm excited to listen. I hope some of our listeners check out your show as well. And while
Yeah,
we're
it'd be
talking
great.
about your and while we're talking about your shows, would love to briefly hear about your music podcast.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's called Steve's New Music Guide. I've thrown my name into the title of both shows. I'm not a narcissist or anything, or am I? Maybe I actually, statistically, I am, based on the titles of these shows. Steve's New Music Guide comes out once a week. I release it on Sundays. It's also released as a podcast, but you can also find it on Ohm 96.3 on Wednesdays and Sundays. It's all about highlighting, spotlighting, showcasing, call it what you will, usually about 4 to 6 artists, many of whom are usually criminally underheard, as I like to say it, playing a little clip of their most recently released tune that I'm digging for one reason or another, and maybe explaining why I think it's a really important piece of music or a catchy piece of music, why it's something I think is pretty timeless, and then maybe also contextualizing that piece. Typically, I'll explain who the artist is, or maybe what the record label is, or why you should care about this artist, or why this genre is something you should really consider, even though maybe you haven't in the past, or that sort of thing. So a little socio-historical context as well sprinkled in there. But it's really like a quick show. It's 12 or 13 minutes. And the idea is just something you can listen on a short commute to get a sense of what's out there in terms of the new music landscape. I think I started it because I love music, as you can probably tell. It's a big piece of my life, but I've also always loved classic rock and old music. And I get a little perturbed or confused when people really sometimes obstinately, declare with conviction that all good music is dead and they don't make anything out there anymore that's worth listening to. I highly disagree with that. I think there's some of the best music ever made is being made right now. It might be tougher to find it because there are so many places to look for it. So part of what I'm doing too is like trying to streamline all the different places to find music and sort of turn the current music landscape, which exists on 5 million platforms, into something a little more reminiscent of the musical landscape during, the classic rock era, where you turn on the radio, maybe you see something on TV once in a while, but that's pretty much it, right? Maybe the band that's coming through town you'll listen to, but other than that, there's no Spotify,
Right.
Apple Music.
It's gotten a little flooded
There's no
out there.
opportunity to stream. Yeah, it's flooded. It's tough to distinguish between the signal and the noise for sure.
Well, it's really cool to hear that you're giving some of these musicians a little bit more of a spotlight, showing some people some really interesting new music, and throughout all of your work, you've really clearly impacted a lot of change. And I'm curious, is there a story of when you really saw something that's like, wow, my work really affected that change?
Yeah, good question. I mean, definitely in small ways all the time. Um, I think, I mean, I have to say, I'm particularly, I think, focused right now on the Good Business Summit, which is a conference that we hold every year. We've been holding it for 10 years. This past iteration in February, just a few weeks ago, February 9th, 2023, was the first year that I directed the summit. And so I think sitting back and watching that program, and it's basically a conference for business leaders from really across the region, but largely the Tri-County area, Charleston, Berkeley, Dorchester here in Greater Charleston, to come together and network with one another and sort of hear a little bit about high road practices and to share with one another what they're doing at their business and to learn what other people are doing at their business and try to do the skills transfer organically. It's a really cool event. There's food and there's drink. And this year I tried to switch things up. I had Charleston Jazz play at the outset, and we flew in this really cool group of people who started things off with a bang. And we had people up and out of their seats networking. And, we do things at the end of the day in breakout sessions. And, we sent folks to like Forte Jazz Lounge for the sustainability breakout session. We had a big focus on environmental sustainability as well. So I don't know, when I look at the business summit, it's sort of like everything in one little package that gets me excited about our work. Yes, it's about making sure that we are supporting local businesses, but I think it's also about shining a light on what local businesses can aspire to. And right now, I'm particularly interested in how we can all be better stewards of our ecology and our environment and our planet. And so I really was particularly inspired by that environmental sustainability and environmental responsibility panel, because it was a bunch of business owners just talking about how small businesses can pull certain levers to be better stewards of their environment, which I thought was pretty cool. So yeah, the Good Business Summit, I think, when I sit back at and watch that event, I'm super proud of what our organization does.
Yeah, it sounds like a really cool event. When does that take place?
Yeah, we just missed it. I wish I had shared it a few months ago with your listeners, but they can always check us out next year. It's February and every year. So next year's, I think, is end of February 2024. And they can go to, I think it's goodbusinesssummit.org. And they'll be able to get tickets probably pretty shortly, in just a few months. And we'll have that lineup in a few months as well.
Great. Well, we'll make sure to include the link in the show notes. And if you'd like, you can ask me a question.
How did you get into film? I'm particularly interested in doubling back on some of that conversation we were having about your work on documentaries. I'm a big documentary fan myself. I know you work with businesses and you support them in various ways. And I'm sort of, generally familiar with what you do, Jeffrey. And I know we'll learn more when I have you on to my podcast, but I don't think I realized the extent to which you're involved with filmmaking. I'd love to learn more about what got you into that.
Yeah, so it's something I've long been passionate about. And at one point in time, early in my career, I put on my bucket list, I want to produce a TV show at some point. That was just something I had in mind. And a fellow Charlestonian, Jeff Howard, who our family sort of grew up together in the Charleston area, he'd been working in LA as an actor and a writer for a while. And I'd say about 8 years ago, he and I were catching up and just talking about the business opportunities in the space. And he had some buddies that he was working on a concept for a production company with, and, invited me to meet them. And long story short, really hit it off with them. We had similar sort of mindsets about comedy and film content in general. And, from there, we've attempted a variety of comedy projects that have gotten various levels of closeness to finish lines of being on platforms that have, fallen through due to the rigors of Hollywood. But, and from there, I just started to make friends in the industry, meet people. I'm passionate about impact as well. And I think that's part of what got me into documentaries. But now I'm really focused on interweaving impact narratives into, scripted stories. So that's where I hope to go from here. Like I said, I have a lot of irons in the fire, but it's an area that I'm both really passionate about, but I also think is one of the few ways that you can maintain people's attention these days and get points across. And it's been shown that, film content can change the way people feel about subject matter. Can soften people's hearts in certain instances, make things feel more relatable. And I think there's a huge opportunity to show the human side of some of these issues that people only hear as media talking points.
For sure. Yeah, completely agree. Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. And we'll go from there into the big question that I ask every guest. If you could snap your fingers and fix one thing in the world, what would it be? And how do you think that change would reverberate?
Man, these questions, these are the biggies. Yeah, these have been great questions. I've really appreciated this conversation, and now he's just stalling for time. Your listeners are thinking
All
to themselves.
good.
So the question, remind me. So snap your fingers and it is fixed. The issue, the problem,
Right.
it goes
So
away.
there might be something in society that you think, well, to change that, we'd need decades because it's going to be so much work. This is something like that, but you can snap your fingers and it's done.
So truthfully, I would. Oh, there's my cat. I snap my fingers. My cat would be out of the screen right now. No, that would be a waste of a wish. I think my answer would be, I know that we're discussing a lot of, topics and themes circulating around business development, but I can't help but go back to, and I think that is an incredibly important part of my life and the organization I work for is changing people's lives for the better. but I don't think I would use my response on that world. I think I'd actually snap my fingers and fix something, which I think is in even more dire need of support than the entrepreneurial ecosystem. I think that the artist ecosystem, I'll go back to what we were talking about earlier, needs the guidance, vision, support that the entrepreneurial ecosystem is getting largely right now. And that would require such an overhaul. I think it's why I'm choosing it, is because it would require such an overhaul of our economic system, of everything that we're doing, like our government, our political architecture would all have to be changed to figure out what that means. I'd love to envision a world where artists do not succeed based strictly on how much monetary support they get from the whims of a donor or a fundraiser. That is an important stream of income and support. Yes, I will not overlook that, but it's just unfortunate to me that, artists, the people in our world who are supportive of like the emotional architecture and heartbeat of society in many ways, like those storytellers, do not have a more reliable source of income that is not more meaningfully directly tied to the transaction of their wares into the hands of their community.
Yeah, I think that's a remarkable perspective and a really interesting answer to that question. I mean, the idea of supporting the arts and how much that goes into sort of our cultural spirit and mindset, and how supporting these people would only allow them to focus more on world-changing art versus focusing on survival.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
So it's been awesome learning about you and your work. I know others listening are super interested as well. How can people support you and your impact?
Yeah, appreciate it. Head on over to lowcountrylocalfirst.org. You can learn more about what we do. If you're not from the Charleston area and you're listening in, honestly, just surround yourself with people who are interested in this sort of work. It's basically called local economic development work. There are versions of Lowcountry Local First across the country, across the globe. These are groups that are interested in empowering their citizenry with understanding how and when and why they can patronize in meaningful ways their local businesses, their businesses that are headquartered in their community. You can go to Amoeba, AMIB, or ILSR. These are organizations that will sort of point you to versions of Lowcountry Local First. I would say just kind of like, immerse yourself in the world of local economic development. It is the key to so many things. Localism right now has always been a key piece of who we are as human beings, right? We are sort of a tribal social species. But I think we're going back to that in a lot of ways. There's a lot of things being written right now. I'd recommend you listen to podcasts and you do some Googling and find some Atlantic magazines or New Yorkers that have articles about this. But localism is the answer to a lot that ails society in social ways, but also in environmental ways. It is a more sustainable way to live. It is a more empathetic way to live. It is a more rich way to live, I think. It's important to think about ways to engage with your localist movements.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. We'll be sure to include some of those national links that you mentioned as well. And Steve, thanks again so much for the time. I'm looking forward to joining you soon on Small Talks, Big Ideas, and continuing our conversation.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you, Jeffrey. It's a pleasure and a privilege, and really appreciated getting to knowing you a little bit better. And look forward to having you on as a guest on my program soon.
Thanks for listening to this episode of People Are the Answer. If you enjoyed the episode, share it with friends, and reviews or subscriptions on your favorite platforms go a long way to help the show grow. I want to share these incredible people and their remarkable work with as many others as possible. Thanks for your support. For more, go to peoplearetheanswer.com.